All right, thanks for settling down in the crowd there, and we'll just get started. So my name is Thomas DeMeo. I've been involved with open source for a number of different years, and I really wanted to share some of my lessons related to engaging with open source communities, specifically from both sides of the table, whether it be on the executive side, where there's a certain level of leadership that's needed around supporting open source and making sure that we're doing the right thing to foster the right community. Or frankly, I started on the technical side where I was always trying to get the attention of the executives to make sure that what we were doing had the right message and we were getting the support we needed. And you know, there's some tips I've learned and around best practices that I wanted to share with this community. Because it's important to make sure that when you're talking about open source, people understand what it's all about and what are the metrics and not getting confused with other things. So I've spent all my career in Silicon Valley, so I may be biased, but I wanted to, again, share that. I've had stints in large organizations, like for example, Adobe and HP, where obviously open source was important. I remember back touching open source in the mid-2000s on some developer tools and some technologies that we had on the Adobe side, but also more recently as CEO of NodeSource, where we're doing a lot around the Node.js ecosystem. So who is this for? It's for both sides of the table. If you're on the technical audience, it's really giving you kind of the language and points to touch upon when having that conversation with executives to make sure you're building the right executive sponsorship and talking the right language, so to speak. But also on the executive side, so that frankly, you know how to foster and grow an audience and build credibility not only with the open source community externally, but also internally with your developers, because this is important. This is what our roles are as executives and leaders, is to make sure that we're growing and fostering that ecosystem. So I wanted to really hail it for both sides, and I'll provide some guidance as the presentation goes on. So if there's any Simon Sinek fans in the audience, Simon Sinek always says, hey, always start with why. Why are people involved in this? Why are people interested in open source in the first place? So I think there's a couple of different reasons. There's certainly areas around professional, and from a professional standpoint, there is, hey, this is a really interesting intellectual challenge. I'm a developer. I have a lot of expertise in maybe a certain domain, and I want to really apply that. This is really interesting challenges, and being open, I have access to everything underneath the covers to be able to do that. There's certainly an element of pride in accomplishment. So, people are intrinsically very creative. They want to be able to apply their talents and creativity to these interesting problems. When it's intellectual and challenging, it's even more exciting. So I think there's a lot of great things that can be done around really, again, using that pride and accomplishment and applying it. They have a unique perspective. I've talked to open source contributors where they come from financial services, or maybe media and publishing, or oil and gas, or government, or all these different domain markets where they understand, trading certain things for financial or whatever it may be. But there's also, on the flip side, people with deep technical expertise. It could be around, how do I deploy to different cloud platforms? What about development languages? What about build systems or cryptography or whatever it may be? So it's really that overlap of what's going on with the technical and expertise. There's also that, people love to get involved in the social and community aspects. I've been to countless developer events, whether it be meetups or DevCons or other events where you want to engage. And it's great that these people may not be the most extroverted on their own, but you get them all together and they really shine and they come together. And I think that sense of community is important for everybody. So that's, I think, a big aspect of why people participate as well. I think it's also based on trust and openness. I mean, the nice thing about open source is if it's done correctly, it's something that can be done in the open and have people not only contribute, but see what's going on. And I think that's attractive, especially for people that have that as a value, as a core belief. So there's a lot of personal reasons why I think people get involved with open source. On the professional side, you start to build credibility and peer recognition, and everybody starts to be kind of the rock star in their area, and that's great. I think peer recognition is important. If you follow GitHub, you know how many people that have stars and what their pulls and commits and what their commit log looks like. That is super attractive. It's also career building in the sense of once you start to build expertise specifically around, again, a domain or a technology or deployment methodology, or maybe a part of the world because you're the best person in South America or Eastern Europe to be able to do these things, that's really, really important because at the end of the day, if I could say so crassly, is you got to pay some bills. And the challenge, I think, is while people, it's great to do these for all the personal reasons on the left-hand side, net is you got bills to pay. And unless you're doing it for purely altruistic reasons, which some can do and some are able to do that, and that's all well and fine, a lot of people are doing it because they need to get involved. So understanding the why behind that, and also the fact that, at the end of the day, they have bills to pay and they will go to the community that really supports their environment and builds them, a pipeline of either opportunities in their career, because a lot of companies hire from their open source community into the company. I know I've done that in past roles because you have your experts in that area. But again, people at the end of the day have bills to pay. So there's an old adage in open source to say, and some people say, and I've been in environments specifically in like financial services and media and publishing where it's like, we have $100 million businesses running on this open source component, but there's a security problem. And then they get a little bit bent out of shape that nobody is in there to update the code. And the old adage is, if you're not willing to maintain it yourself, don't use it, because security happens. As I like to say in the last line, software is a living, breathing organism. It needs care and feeding. It needs to be maintained. And it frankly needs incentive. And I think a big opportunity in the open source going forward is what is the right incentive mechanism for people that keeps them current and keeps the code current. So when security issues happen, when new platforms emerge, whether it be cloud or things like containerization, they're motivated to keep this current. I think that's very, very important. What I like to look for, and one of the pieces of guidance I would give the audience is, look for the sweet spot between who in an area has a given domain expertise. So think about that again, financial services, media and entertainment, government, mineral and mining, whatever that domain like market is area, but also who has the technical expertise. There are people that understand big data or containerization or cloud platforms, or there's a company moving to Amazon or Azure or Google or whatever it may be. There's always that overlap between who's doing, like who knows this area better than anybody else, and also what is their overlap. And to me, because there's a lot of noise, and the best way to do it is kind of filter out the noise, the signal from the noise. Focus on the signal. To me, that's the sweet spot. Tip number one would be to look across the workflow. So in any software deployment project, there's always an element of, I'm starting, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? And a lot of these continue to move on. So the names may be different. So early in a workflow, it could be around designing or defining or ideating. If you're maybe in a creative workflow or media and publishing, or if you're in a process management, it could be around designing what is the use cases and such. There's that whole middle area around building and modeling. Okay, I'm going to start to put together a data model, and I may start to articulate something. I may start to do create if I'm in media publishing. Maybe there's pre-production, post-production. Later on, there's, I'm either deploying something to a cloud, or I'm testing it and delivering it. And typically, part of that, an important part, is that monitoring, that analyzing and tracking. So I think an important tip number one is back to that Venn diagram of where do people have technical or domain expertise. Really understand not only what is their expertise, but where is it in the workflow. Some people are great up front, some people are great in the middle, some people are great in back. Have a good understanding of that, and your role as an executive is to get a feel for the community and understand where that is. Your role as a technical person is really to shine in your given area, to be the best in your area, so that you have that credibility, so that, again, you can be recognized as your leader. So that would be tip number one is, from an executive, know who's best. Number two is be the best in your given area. Tip number two is really the flip side. That's the other side of the Venn diagram. That is the technical expertise. If you have the most certifications on a given cloud platform, or what Red Hat's doing with OpenShift, or another containerization technology, or build environment, or that is your special sauce. That is your sweetness that you're going to have. You could be the rock star in a development language, one of the platforms I mentioned before. You could be the AI ML expert in a certain area. But again, you have to bring your expertise and then be loud and proud about it. I think part of a developer or a technologist role is to, while it's great to be in the area, tie it to use cases, tie it to different areas where people can actually bring business value from it. To be the best in a certain area, and also as an executive standpoint, to separate the signal from the noise, focus on the signal. To use a simple analogy, there's always like a 2x2 matrix working around in a lot of executives' minds of, you're going to spend time with the people that are high and to the right, the people that have that high domain expertise. They're the best in financial services or media and publishing, or the people that have the high technical expertise, again, media and publishing or AI for cloud or for GCP or whatever it may be, and that is your expertise, and be proud about it from the technology side and focus that on the executive side. It's doable. It's doable, but it requires work. And I think from not only a technologist standpoint, but from an executive standpoint, it's your role. I found some of my best and most rewarding days as an executive, having a product background, was spending time with developer communities. That's where the energy is, that's where the excitement is, that's where a lot of people that are super passionate are, that give us energy to get through all the other aspects of our roles that are maybe less exciting and a little mundane. So your role, as I would recommend, would be to engage in that conversation. I think it's important that you have a voice, you know who is who. You have an opinion. I think people like people with opinions, and bring that as much as you can. Know who is who. Who is in that area that's either going to be in one of those Venn diagram circles to make sure that you know the expert in a given domain or a given technology area. Know what that ecosystem provides. There could be an expert in a certain domain that is great at one area because, and this comes up later on, because they have a reason to stay engaged, you may be able to channel and funnel business, which helps them and it helps you, which gets back to the people who are going to have bills to pay, and it's best to help them out. Another tip would be, be that human, be that person inside the company. If you're an executive, don't be this faceless person inside of an organization that either they don't know who the heck you are, or you're too, you're not engaged with it. That's not going to be able to help you. If you're in a product role or a leadership role, whether it be in product or engineering or marketing or sales, it's a lot easier to work with humans and a lot of work with people. So, be involved as much as you can. Be that inside connection. A lot of people want inside connections to either deals or customers or trends, or maybe they're sponsors of certain conferences in their areas, and it's good they want to deal with real folks on that one. Share the information both internally. I've worked with a lot of teams internally where they may be doing a developer event or a meetup or maybe a hackathon. Share what are those metrics and KPIs that you're really driving towards, because if you're on the technical side and you're talking up to management or leadership, that's the lingua franca that they understand. That's really the language is how many people are going to engage with, what really are the terms of that. People don't do things because it's fun or it's cool. They do things, especially from an executive standpoint, when they understand really what the metrics are. I've had a lot of success in seeing teams share their roadmaps as publicly as possible. That can't always be done because maybe some roadmap items are for a given customer, and that customer is private. But to the degree that there's customer input, that is obviously an important point as well. And then again, define the success criteria and make it repeatable. I think one of the challenges that can happen around open source is because it's not a direct path. If you're an executive, you're trying to drive revenue and you're trying to drive engagement, open source is an important part of that, but the metrics are going to be different. It's not all about, each developer is part of a total addressable market and it's a pipeline. It's much more indirect than that. And you also not want to throw good money after bad. You have to have something that's a repeatable engagement. So you don't want to do a bunch of one-off events. You want to basically say, okay, how am I going to approach this given domain and make this repeatable and not have to do a bunch of one-offs, which is more inefficient. So think about scalability and how something like that would happen. I'll spend a little time talking about really some maybe lessons learned around engagement. So this is my Engagement 101 class in 5 minutes. I think successful open source getting traction inside of an organization, it starts with finding out what is your right C-level executive that you can get to support. Is that the CTO? Is that the product lead? Is that the CEO? But you need to have some element of C-level leadership, because there are going to be metrics that are maybe a little ambiguous you're going to have to get over in the early days, but having that C-level support is super important. Number two is, things without budgets are just, fantasies, they're not realities. So I think there has to be an element of, based on those, KPIs or rules that you want to engage in, what is really the, you're going to have to secure some budget for that. It doesn't have to be a lot. One thing that I've seen in the past is, it doesn't have to be the fanciest thing in the world. That's not necessarily what developers are looking for, but you have to show up and you have to have a face and you have to be present. I think that's important. It's also best when it's someone's day job. When it's someone's day job, it's going to happen. It's someone who's waking up in the organization thinking about this, as opposed to, I'll get to it, quote, in my spare time, which I don't think is ever really a good solution, because spare time is obviously very, very difficult to happen. I think cross-functional support is also equally necessary when driving across not just technology and product, but sales and marketing. I think we've all seen in certain organizations where there could be an antibody from, say, in a sales organization that is thinking that, oh my gosh, open source, that's that free thing, that's killing my deals. Well, that's actually not the case. It could be a way to, again, get people engaged with your product. It could be a way to build a developer ecosystem. It could be a way to keep the product more current, maybe more secure because more people are looking at it. It's not a bad thing. So getting, for example, a sales team on board with why we're doing open source is something that has to be told early and often. Salespeople forget, salespeople churn out. Keep that conversation going. Same thing for marketing, is just focus on the basics of what is important from an engagement. I think from a CTO or a chief product officer standpoint, having that leadership and engagement and being that human face, as I mentioned before, is super important. I think that's going to be critical going for that. Make it repeatable. So again, you don't want to come up and, hey, in January we tried this, in February we tried that, in March we tried this, and we're still kind of like searching for a model. Unless you're communicating that you're really trying to refine something, you're going to look like you're jumping all over the place, and that's not a way that you're going to build executive support or, frankly, spend your time wisely inside of an organization, because you haven't found that repeating model. I think once you start small, crawl, walk, run. Once you get that going, then you can start to build support and communicate a lot internally, specifically around the metrics that people care about, whether it be engagement or new trial accounts or active use or stickiness of a certain feature or code commits or pulls or whatever it may be. Be clear on your metrics, and then be loud and proud about the reporting of that. And then understand and set expectations on both sides. That goes back to kind of understanding the KPIs and what the metrics all around it. Know where the value add is. Know where, as I talked about before in the Venn diagram example, are we going after a certain domain space, financial services, media and publishing, whatever it may be, or is this on, we need to get and engage with the community around moving to the cloud or some large initiative that people have. Understand the value add of your audience and also your community, and then really try to be that person that can broker that relationship. And here's an important tip is on the right-hand side, developers are smart, intelligent people. They want interesting challenges that I mentioned before. If you're not supporting them, they'll go where they are supported. So it really requires, back to, it's someone's day job, it needs sufficient oversight and a champion, because that's the energy that's needed. It can't be something, garbage in, garbage out. They will go to, if you're really trying to build a community around this, you got to support the developers that do that. So if there's one slide that I would kind of summarize everything on, and it's a little bit of an eye chart, is think specifically around, for your given role, if you're the CTO or the head of engineering, or maybe you're in a developer relations role, if you are from the product side and you're product management, or maybe on the design side, or specifically marketing, what are the things that you can do to better engage? Again, this is a full contact sport. This is something that requires investment. And some of the things I'd recommend would be, again, from an engineering standpoint, I've seen developers do a great job on fleshing out what they're doing with additional tech docs and samples, because the community wants to have that reference point. It's about reducing friction and getting people up to speed faster. So certainly focusing on people on tech docs and having your developers engage there is important. Having accessibility. So for example, regular office hours where people know, hey, I got a technology problem, I'm trying to implement this thing. I know that these guys are experts internally, guys or gals are experts. here's a typical time I can engage with them for either, Q&A or just some dialogue around it. I think, because our job is to make it easy for communities to engage and grow, a lot of these how-to samples are important. Open source, and by definition, developers are around the world, so from a technology standpoint, having your product built in such a way that people can bring additional language packs makes it accessible to other parts of the world. So think about that from the early on and from the get-go. Other engagements that can happen, whether it be to hackathons or staying active on the forums and meetups, not just in your own domain, but also upstream and downstream. I used that analogy earlier about knowing where you are in your workflow. If you are the best in deployment or development or testing or QA, what are the communities upstream and downstream from you? Spending time in those can be equally, if not more valuable, because it's really thinking about expansive and expanding the footprint across the ecosystem. So that is, again, an example of a full contact sport, think broadly. Around the products standpoint, I believe in having solid developer relations and having a face of the business to be able to go to, and also having that person, again, provide those docs and samples, maybe more use case based, maybe less of the technical side, depends on the type of DevRel you're able to get. There's a metaphor for providing public roadmaps. I've worked with a lot of developer ecosystems where they want to make sure that what they're doing you don't run it over, you don't clobber them and pull out their business. So I think having visibility around, here's what we're doing now, here's what we're doing next, and here's what we're doing never, sets that communication and dialogue and goes back to that early transparency so that, again, people understand what is happening and either they can steer clear or they can complement because they know that you're never going to go after this one part of the workflow because it's not a big enough area. So that's important. Again, the different building blocks I mentioned earlier, understand where they are in the use case. I think communities can be great around design thinking exercises, really getting into their heads to understand what customers are they seeing, how are they approaching different problems, how might we exercises. There could be previews and betas. There's API designs. A lot of times I've seen development teams going after it and thinking that this is going to be the API model and data model that's going to work well. But frankly, they didn't think about some edge cases or some other areas. So I think having that open dialogue with communities can be great to flesh out things like API layers and things like that. And certainly some wireframes and UI UX about how could we engage, because oftentimes the community handles with not just your environment, but several others and has great input as well. Marketing is important as well. I mean, it's a great way to engage, and if you're a marketing leader, know where there's pros and cons, but certainly from a messaging, is something gonna resonate? Is something toxic when you talk about it? Have that awareness. I've engaged with a lot of communities in the past where they have case studies and referrals. That can also be equally as interesting. Provide budget and air cover and support for whether it be independent events or not, whether that be you're going to send a person on site, or you're going to have budget, or you're going to pick up the pizza and beer tab, whatever it may be. Think about ways to really engage if you're from the marketing role on side that. If you have corporate events and you want to engage with the community, think about how you might have a community event either before or after or during or at a breakout or whatever it may be to, again, use your marketing dollars and expand and engage better with the community. Another way to kind of reward and recognize is around showcases and awards and really kind of have that community engagement, which I think is important. But there's also caveats, and there's also things that you should be aware equally of what it is not. And I think it's important to know where people's roles and expectations are and really what their value add and expertise. Open source developers, while great, they're not a replacement for talking to your what I call real customers. Real customers are the people that don't have that deep expertise or technical understanding, or maybe have the the passion that the open source developers have. They may be a person inside of a large organization that's just trying to get their job done, and to think that they're gonna suck up and deal with all the rough edges and friction related to your product, they're probably not going to do that. So it's not an excuse for not talking to customers. You still need to talk to customers, really the people that is your target persona and the people you're going to engage with, because again, you're going to get a great view from the open source community, and they're going to tolerate great things, but they're not a direct one-to-one proxy. So that's number one. Number two is understanding the pain points across that developer lifecycle, whether it be at the build time or test or deploy or maintain or update or rolling it. A developer or an open source community may be great at one area, but back to that diagram before, they may not ever have a chance to upgrade, or they're not ever going to integrate with another third party because that's not just what they do. So be aware of where they're at in that life cycle, and make sure that you're cognizant of how to manage that bestly, and understand really what is their motivation. Is it, again, back to the earlier slide, is it the passion and creativity? Is it the intellectual challenge? They're trying to build a lifestyle business around it. That's all well and fine. Just be aware of that. So be eyes wide open, and they're very, very disparate. So there's not one size fits all for any of this type of stuff. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with marketing and sales where they think, oh my gosh, we have a huge open source community. We have a bunch of contributors. This is all going to be qualified leads. This is all of our sales pipeline. And I can put these people, I'm going to contact all of them. That's not a good idea. Don't think of them as direct lead generation opportunities. They could get there, but I wouldn't build a business model based on, I have 10 figures of developers and I only need a small 1% of that and I can build this huge revenue business. I think there's different ways to think about open source communities, not necessarily as putting a dollar sign on their head and thinking that they're all going to convert over to qualified pipeline. There's a lot of different ways they can add value, whether it be on, again, looking at security, building a developer ecosystem, filling out the edges around maybe parts of the solution that you haven't thought about yet, but it's not about sales pipeline. And if you have a salesperson coming to you saying, geez, we should just kill this thing because it's getting away, it's killing our sales, maybe that's not the type of salesperson you should be having in the organization to sell open source. It's a very unique animal on that. So again, the expectations with sales, I cannot emphasize enough. And I would say that if you can make friends with whoever is running sales and be part of their sales QBR and part of their weekly calls or whatever, be that person. As I mentioned before, be that human, be that face. It's a full contact sport. Another thing I would recommend is, especially with engaging, is don't measure how busy someone is related to, I went to this show, I went to that show, I did this and that. That's, and I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, a little bit of the busy work. Measure the impact. Measure what is the, whether it be how the project is being fleshed out, or what the commits and pulls are, or the actual tangible work, not just I had a bunch of great conversations, because while that's all well and fine, very quickly that's going to turn into, kind of show me the business impact. So be ready for that. Whether you're coming from the technology side and you're trying to get that executive support, or you're the executive, ask for those numbers so that you can, again, build that dialogue. And one of the last is, the great thing about open source is, the community that it has around the world and the contributions it can have around the world, but also it never sleeps. And I remember instances of waking up on a Saturday morning and something happened the night before, and it's now going off. And it is one of those, it's 24/7, it's around the globe, you have to be culturally sensitive to it, and it never sleeps. Plan accordingly. Doesn't mean you shouldn't engage, but just realize, back to, it's someone's day's job, you have KPIs in place, you have metrics in place, you have an engagement model. Plan accordingly, because this is something that I think can be very, very successful, but it doesn't happen by happenstance. It happens because, again, there's a good dialogue and good education around it. I'll reiterate this point again. Developers are smart, creative people that love intellectual challenges, and they want to be supported and they want to have engagement. If you're not doing that, there are plenty of projects where that is being supported. So please understand that it's not we're not going to engage with our community because the sales guy said it's getting away deals. Not the way to think about it. They'll go someplace else, and next thing you know, you don't have a business around that. So I wanted to keep this brief, and that would be some lessons that I've learned over my tenure in the industry. If you have any questions or any for me or anything else, you can hit me up with a DM at the Twitter handle, and that's it for today. Thanks for coming.